What are the steps of a human act? Hi, I'm Mike Mason. This is St. Joe Society podcast. The St. Joe Society is a Catholic lay apostolate devoted to help men order all things to Christ by growing strong in mind, body, and spirit. If you'd like to learn more about our work, you can check us out online at stjosephsociety.org. This is the Intro to Moral Theology, episode 15. All right, fellas, what we're going to look at this week is the steps of a human act, okay? Now, in week 1, we talked about the fact that what our end is, like whether we achieve our goal or not, is dependent upon what we do, okay? So whether we end up in heaven or not depends on what we do. And we talked about why God sets things up that way. Last week, we talked about what constitutes an ethical act. Because human acts follow from a unity of intellect and will, what constitutes an ethical act is our knowledge, which is in our intellect, and freedom, which is in our will. And as I said last week, we'll return to both of those in greater detail in the next couple months. What I want to turn to next is I want to analyze the steps when we make a human act. If you recall, we made a distinction between an act of a human, like snoring, sneezing, stuff like that, and a human act, which is one done from deliberation. What we're going to do in this episode is we're going to break down in more detail what goes into a human act. And the reason why we want to do this is that when we make good choices, okay, and we're reflecting back on our good choices, we want to be able to identify the things that went well. And then there's times when we're going to make choices where they don't go well. We don't like the consequences, the effects that happen because of them. We need an ability to look back and say, okay, where did I go wrong in this choice so I can fix it in the future? Breaking down the human act, that's what this is, okay? So let's just launch in. Since every moral act proceeds from the powers of intellect and will, we're gonna look at the parts of or steps of a moral act. Okay, so all our moral actions follow from intellect and will. Therefore, we're gonna look at the parts. Because when we do things, we do them on purpose. Okay, we're not talking about things we do on accident. We're not talking about acts of humans. We're talking about human acts. Human acts are purposive. Okay. What we're going to look at is we're going to break this down into 3 parts. First, before you can act, you have to consider the end or the goal. Then you have to consider the means to the end. And then finally, you actually have to do it. You have to execute. Okay. So a little commonsensical here. Whenever you want to do anything, you got to think about why you're doing it. So what's the end? What's the goal? What are the ways about achieving that end? And then you can't stop there. You actually have to do it. Okay. Now, as I said before, a human act is this interchange between intellect and will. Okay, so you have intellect and will, and what the intellect's going to do, because intellect's in charge, okay, it's out in front. The intellect's going to do something, then the will responds. Intellect, will, intellect, will, intellect, and will. Okay, we're going to walk through this exchange, which, as I explain it, you guys are going to find is pretty commonsensical. I think I'm hoping have some insights that'll be helpful for you, things you haven't thought about. But a lot of this hopefully is just bringing kind of common sense together. But we're going to see how these two things interact. Okay. Now, there are 9 steps altogether. The first 2 steps concern the end. So when you're considering what the goals of your action is, the next 4, okay, so 2 for the intellect and 2 for the will, those are the 4. They concern the means. Okay. So figuring out how I'm going to do it. And then the final 3 steps have to do with the will. Okay. So that's how that's going to work. So let's start with the steps concerned with an end. Okay. The first step before you do anything is you have to discern whether the thing that you're going to go after is desirable for its own sake. So it's whatever the goal is, okay, going to college, going to heaven, whatever. Is it desirable for its own sake? So is it worth doing? Okay. Now, what comes with that also is you have to think about whether it's actually doable for you. Okay. If you have some sort of goal that's not doable for you, then the whole situation stops at step number 1. So let's say, I'm a 42-year-old guy as I'm recording this. I'm 42 years old, about 6 feet tall, and I weigh about 190 pounds. Okay. If I said, you know what I'm going to try to do in the next few years? I'm going to try to play football in the NFL. Okay. And yeah, that's desirable for its own sake because it's a great thing. Okay. That's not a realistic goal. Like I can't actually do that. So my deliberation and discernment about playing NFL football as a 42-year-old, as I sit here and stand, that's not realistic. So the reasoning process is over. All right. So in step one, you have to think, what is my end or my goal? Is it worth doing and is it doable? Okay. Now let's say, now again, we haven't figured out what the means are. Like, how am I going to do it? It's just like, do I think this is doable? Well, what happens is if the intellect says, yes, it is, then what happens is you have an intention. Now, the intention at this point is not free, because anytime you put something like good before your will just attaches to it. So once your intellect says, hey, we should do this thing, we can do this thing, the will automatically just intends it. Okay. Because that's what it wants to do. All right. Now, what we have to do next, we have to figure out how we're going to do it. So the next 4 steps, we already covered the first 2, have to do with the means. So what we're going to do next is called deliberation or counsel. So once I say, that's the goal, that's what I'm going to do, your will's like, yeah, let's do it. Intention. Now you have to deliberate. What you have to do is for many things, if not most things, there's multiple means. There's multiple ways to achieve the same end, same goal. So what you do here is at this level, you're taking counsel and you're deliberating. What are the viable options for me to do this? Okay. Maybe there's 2, maybe there's 4, but you're going to discern and work through that. Okay. At this point in the process, it's still pretty theoretical because you're just kind of thinking about like how this thing's going to work itself out. Now, let's say you settle on the 3 or 4 you're doing. Well, that's where your will then, what the intellect is going to pitch it to the will, and the will does what's called consenting. Okay. Consent, what's happening here is you're applying this deliberation to yourself. So your will's like, hey, we can do this, from kind of putting in anthropomorphic terms. Yeah, we can do this thing. So the will consents to it. Then the intellect, continuing this process, okay, has to limit whatever you figured out through deliberation to one option, because you can't do multiple things at once. So sooner or later, you're going to have to pick one of them. So deliberation ends with this judgment. Once the judgment's been determined, it kicks it over to the will, and the will makes a choice, or it's called an election choice, whatever you want to call it. It's a choice. Okay. So notice here, let's go back to review real quick. We think of a goal and we say, is this thing realistic? If the answer is yes, the will goes, let's do it. It intends it. Then the step 2, okay, we would deliberate about it. Like, what are the possible ways to achieve this thing? Once we discern a couple of those, the will go, okay, we're cool with those. That's called consent or election. Then the intellect pops back in and says, okay, now we have to figure out this one option we're going to do and make a choice. So let's use an illustration at this point of choosing a college. So say, I want to get a college education. Let's say that's realistic. You can pay for it. You got a high enough IQ. Okay, you intend it. Then you say, I'm going to look at schools, and you whittle them down to 3 or 4 options to get your college education. That'd be deliberation. But you can only go to one school. So you got to limit it down to one and then make your choice. Now, at this end of the process, you're not finished, obviously, because you haven't done anything. All you've done is thought about the ends and the means. The final step is what's called execution. So these are the steps in execution. So what the intellect's going to do is it's going to command the will to get moving. So your intellect's going to say, hey, let's go. So it issues a command, okay, to the active power of the will, because the will wants to go, but it needs direction. The will then executes the plan, okay? And then at the end, if everything works out well, step number 9, all the way at the end, is delight and enjoyment. So you enjoy achieving the end that you did, okay? That's a basic idea. So let's just rehash it in like conversational type ways. When we're making choices, fellas, we think about, okay, what's the end or goal of what I'm about to do? Is this thing doable for me? If the answer is yes, your will says, all right, let's go. That's intention. Then you have to deliberate, say, okay, how many different means are there to achieve it? So how many different ways can I do this? It's called deliberation. Let's say you whittle it down to 2, 3, 4 options. Then it pitches it to the will, and the will consents. The will goes, yes, yeah, we can do this. These things that you thought about, intellect, they apply to us. That's what the will's kind of saying. Okay. Then the intellect jumps back in and has to limit it down to one choice. Once it limits down to one, it pitches it down to the will, and the will then chooses. This will act. Will goes, okay, that's the one. Here we go. Finally, we have to execute it. So the intellect goes in and says, all right, here we go. Gives the commands. The will executes. And if everything works out well, we have delight and enjoyment at the end. Why is this so important? We're going to talk a little bit later, okay? We're going to talk a little bit later about ways of doing conscience. And there's a thing called antecedent and consequent conscience. Antecedent conscience is when you think about stuff before you act. Consequent is when you reflect upon what you did and think about whether it's a good idea or not. We need to know these steps, guys. And again, you don't need to memorize all 9, but the basic step through, okay, should be hopefully pretty clear for you to do. It's important to do this because prior to making big decisions like where you're going to go to college, are you going to get married, who are you going to marry, stuff like that, you really need to go through each one of these 9 steps one at a time and carefully. So that's why you need it on the front end, antecedently. Consequently, we're going to make choices sometimes and we're going to be surprised by the effects, or we're going to determine, or things just aren't going to go according to plan. If you know these steps, you can reflect back and go, like, what did I go wrong here? So let's say a guy's trying to make some choices and he's really frustrated he's not achieving his goal. Okay. And let's just use me as an example. Let's say I'm frustrated I'm not achieving my goal of going to the NFL. Well, where did I go wrong in my reasoning? I could say, well, my workout plan's good. I got it from, an NFL personal trainer. So my workout plans are good. I'm putting all the time in. I'm whatever. Well, where did I go wrong? All the means I chose are good means. But every time I try to execute this plan, it doesn't work. Like, what's going on here? Well, you'd say, no, you need to go back to number 1. It was never realistic in the first place. That's where you went wrong. Or let's say someone picks a realistic goal, all right, and they limit options down, and then the one they choose of the 3 that were left just was the bad one, but there's another one in there. Well, they could go back to those steps and say, I choose the wrong one of the 3 or 4. I need to go with a different one. Maybe that's where the problem is. Or maybe the person's problem is they have good ends, they have good means. Maybe their problem is they just ain't doing it. So it's an execution problem. Well, again, this helps us kind of identify these things, not only in ourselves, but in other people we're training, like our children. We're encouraging maybe our wives or friends to make good choices. This toolbox can help you out a whole bunch to help people. Okay. Now, before we close, I want to make one little qualification. These steps to this process, okay? I'm not claiming that you go through this 9-step process every time you make a choice, okay? This would be when you're doing something that's like an actual intention, okay? So when you're choosing which college to go to or who you're going to marry, you're going to make an actual intention. You're going to think through this process, actually attend it, drive it through the end, stuff like that. There are also things called virtual intentions and habitual intentions. And I'm not going to get into habitual right now, but what a virtual intention is it's when you intend something and then as you're executing it, you don't accomplish it right away. You just kind of, but the intention you had in the beginning kind of soaks through everything else, so to speak. Okay. So a virtual intention, let's say you get up in the morning, you do your morning offering and you say, Lord God, I intend that everything I do today is going to be for your glory and for my neighbor's good. Okay. When we pray the morning offering, right, it's in there that we want to do that. When you really intend that, you don't have to consciously think about that goal through the rest of the day when you're driving to work or doing whatever, because that intention is in everything you're doing virtually. You don't have to be consciously thinking about it, but it's still there. Okay. That's the same is true in here. So when you decide to do something like, try to get in shape or something like that, you don't have to think about consciously, I'm trying to get in shape when you're running on a treadmill or when you're lifting some weights or when you're eating healthy meals. Okay. Because your original intention virtually just lasts through. Okay. So a little important qualification there. But we're butting up against the end of our time together. So I hope that was helpful for you guys. Super practical podcast today. And hopefully it's something you can pass on to your children, your friends, and can really help them as well. So I hope you guys have a blessed week, and I look forward to catching up with you guys next time.